For years, geneticists noticed something strange. No matter where humans came from, Africa, Asia, Europe, the Americas, our DNA was shockingly similar. Too similar. Most species show wide genetic variation across populations. We barely showed any. Something had happened, something that had erased almost every human bloodline on Earth, and it happened within living memory of your oldest ancestors. To understand why that matters, you need to understand what DNA diversity actually tells you. Every species accumulates genetic variation over time. Mutations, inherited differences, small copying errors that stack up across generations. The longer a species has existed, the more variation it carries. Chimpanzees, our closest relatives, have been around for roughly the same amount of time we have. They show 4 times more genetic diversity than we do. So do gorillas. Even subspecies of orangutans show more variation within their own population than all 8 billion humans on Earth show collectively. That's not normal. That's the fingerprint of a catastrophe. Geneticists have a name for what leaves that fingerprint: a bottleneck. A moment when a population collapses so severely that most genetic variation is simply lost. The way you lose most of the colors when you reduce a painting to 3 or 4 shades. Whatever variation survives is only whatever happened to exist in the handful of individuals who made it through. And the smaller the surviving group, the more variation is permanently erased. Whatever happened 70,000 years ago left a mark so deep that you can read it in a blood sample today. So what happened? On the island of Sumatra, in what is now Indonesia, there is a lake called Lake Toba. It sits inside a depression 100 kilometers long and 30 kilometers wide, surrounded by mountains. It is one of the most beautiful places on Earth. It is also a crater. Specifically, it is the largest volcanic crater produced by any eruption in the last 2 million years. Around 74,000 years ago, the volcano beneath what would become Lake Toba erupted. Not in the way volcanoes erupt in news footage: lava flows, ash clouds, dramatic orange light. This was a completely different order of event. It ejected roughly 2,800 cubic kilometers of material into the atmosphere. Mount St. Helens, the eruption that devastated an entire American state in 1980, ejected about 1 cubic kilometer. Toba produced 2,800 times that. In a matter of days, the ashfall alone covered most of South Asia in a layer up to 15 centimeters deep. Traces have been found in ice cores in Greenland, in ocean sediments off the coast of East Africa, in ancient soil layers across India and the Arabian Peninsula. This was not a regional disaster. It was a planetary one. And then came the cold. When that much material is blasted into the upper atmosphere, it blocks sunlight, not partially, substantially. Researchers estimate that Toba triggered a volcanic winter lasting somewhere between 6 and 10 years. Global temperatures dropped by an estimated 3 to 5 degrees Celsius. In some regions, up to 15. Plants that needed sunlight died. Animals that needed those plants died. The food chain, essentially everywhere on Earth, fractured at once. In 1998, anthropologist Stanley Ambrose at the University of Illinois published a paper proposing what became known as the Toba Catastrophe Theory. His argument was that this single eruption pushed the human population to the absolute edge of extinction. His estimate: somewhere between 3,000 and 10,000 individuals survived. Some researchers have pushed that figure lower still. Whatever the exact number, the genetic evidence points in the same direction. At some point around this time, the human family tree was pruned almost to nothing. But here's where it gets complicated, because not everyone agrees. In 2018, archaeologists excavating rock shelters at South Africa's Pinnacle Point published findings that should have been impossible under the original theory. They found continuous human occupation directly above and below a layer of Toba ash. The same people, using the same stone tools, living in the same place before and after the eruption. They hadn't fled, they hadn't died, they had simply continued, and they weren't alone. A 2020 study examining sediment cores from Lake Malawi found that African ecosystems showed disruption after Toba, but not the catastrophic collapse the volcanic winter model predicted. The vegetation record was damaged. It was not destroyed. What this tells us is something more complicated and more interesting than a simple extinction event. Toba didn't kill everyone everywhere. It killed almost everyone, almost everywhere. What survived were pockets, small groups in specific locations, protected by geography, by available food sources, by proximity to coastlines where marine resources provided nutrition that land-based ecosystems simply couldn't. The survivors weren't random. They were specifically located, specifically resourceful. And the groups were small enough that maintaining any real genetic diversity across the whole human population became nearly impossible. The bottleneck wasn't one catastrophic moment. It may have been a decade of slow attrition, a volcanic winter gradually starving populations that had been thriving, groups that numbered in the thousands reduced to dozens, dozens reduced to families, and then the long, fragile work of recovery, so precarious that the wrong drought, the wrong season, the wrong encounter could have ended everything. The people who survived almost certainly did so on coastlines. A series of excavations at Pinnacle Point in South Africa found evidence of shellfish harvesting, ochre processing, and refined blade tools dating to precisely this period. These were not desperate people barely clinging to survival. They were sophisticated. They were using the ocean as a food source that volcanic ash simply couldn't touch. The sea didn't care about Toba. Its ecosystems recovered faster than land. And the people resourceful enough to exploit that had something inland populations didn't: a way through. But here's what makes this genuinely extraordinary. These coastal survivors weren't only keeping themselves alive. The ochre at Pinnacle Point wasn't being collected. It was being ground, mixed, processed, almost certainly for symbolic purposes. Body decoration, ritual marking, communication. In the middle of the worst catastrophe their species had ever faced, humans were still making art, still transmitting meaning beyond pure survival. Whatever that impulse is, it was apparently non-negotiable. Even at the edge of extinction, it didn't switch off. And then, roughly 60,000 years ago, something shifted. The climate stabilized, populations began recovering. Within a few thousand years, the descendants of those coastal survivors started moving out of Africa, following the same coastlines and marine resources that had kept them alive, spreading into Arabia, into South Asia, into territory the volcanic winter had emptied. They moved into a world that had nearly swallowed them whole, and they moved through it like they owned it. Because by then, in a sense, they did. The Toba bottleneck means something specific for how we understand everything that came after. It means that every language ever spoken descended from a language spoken by a population smaller than most modern towns. Every culture, every form of music, mathematics, philosophy, grief, all of it descended from the survivors of a single catastrophic decade. The diversity of human experience that we sometimes read as evidence of how different we are from each other is, in geological terms, the equivalent of a few generations of variation. We are, all of us, astonishingly close. Geneticists working on human population history have consistently found that humans show less genetic variation than a single troop of chimpanzees in a West African forest. That statistic sounds like it should feel diminishing. It doesn't. It means every person you have ever met, every person who has ever lived across every civilization on every continent in all of recorded history traces back to the same improbably small group of people who survived an impossible decade on a coastline in southern Africa. Go back to that DNA sample. The strange uniformity that kept puzzling geneticists. The thing that didn't add up for a species that had supposedly been spreading and diversifying for 300,000 years. Now, you know what it is. It's a scar. The molecular record of a moment when the human story nearly ended. 70,000 years ago, a small group of people who had no name for what had happened to the sky kept going anyway. They found the coast. They found the shellfish. They kept pressing red ochre into the walls of caves. And they kept whatever it is that makes us human alive through a decade that should have been the last one. You carry that survival in every cell of your body. The bottleneck didn't just shape our DNA. It shaped everything we became after it. Every idea, every word, every choice you will make today is the continuation of something that almost wasn't. They made it through by the smallest possible margin. And so, eventually, did you?